Hi, welcome to Real Film Snobs. I am joined today by special guest host Scott Hossner. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
I know it's been a while, I think probably
Hmm.
pre-COVID. And so I don't know if that was 10 years ago or 2 years at this point, but I
Yeah.
definitely know it's been a couple of years. So just to remind the folks at home who may not have seen your wonderful face in a while, Scott Hossner is a longtime friend of the show and a good friend of mine, of course, as well, and a sponsor of the show with his company, Allied Video Productions, and a movie buff. He does not like to say he is a film snob, he is a movie buff.
You have a
Um,
good memory for that little clarification.
I know he always like. I remember you've mentioned it many a time. So, and Scott just returned from Hollywood, so he'll maybe give us a few tales of some things he saw. I remember. I'm going to find a way to work MacGuffin into our conversation today, which is an inside joke right now. But
Right.
maybe Scott will have time to explain how we're smarter in Salem, Oregon, than some of the theaters are in Los Angeles, California.
Yes,
So
indeed. That was weird.
today we have a themed episode, which is really exciting. This is one that Scott and I brainstormed, and Scott came up with the fabulous name Under the Gaydar, which I thought was wonderfully punny. So great and very
It's a
cheesy.
dad
Great.
joke. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of your humor, though, Scott. Let's face it.
Fair enough.
So I was trying to think of something more esoteric that, wouldn't be like offensive to anyone, but would be, kind of cool. And then you were like, Under the Gaydar. I said, we'll go with that. So we're going to talk about gay themed movies that maybe were under the radar a little bit. So not the most mainstream films. And so we had a lot to choose from because I would say actually most gay films are pretty much under the radar with the exception of a handful. I mean, people think of Brokeback Mountain, ones that are actually like big budget movies, but that's not very many of them,
Right.
especially if you go back a ways. So we each picked two movies that we wanted to review. So for this episode, so we'll start off with my first pick, which is Tongues Untied from 1989 by director Marlon Riggs. This is an experimental documentary that uses poetry, rap, and narrative to discuss what it means to be a Black gay man in America. This is considered one of the seminal works of gay cinema. Marlon Riggs, in fact, has been iconized with a whole collection of his works, short films and feature lengths that he did before he died tragically. And so, one of the things that I actually have seen Tugs Untied before years ago, but right now on the Criterion Channel, they have a whole package of his work signifying. So I wanted to delve into this particular one because it's considered, I think, his most important film in a lot of ways. Originally aired on PBS and became a huge national controversy when it came out, and had people. He only got $5,000 from the National Endowment for the Arts, so it wasn't the main funder of the film, but it caused a big stir in Congress, and conservative congressional people got up and said it was blasphemy. They hadn't seen the film, of course. They just the idea of it. They called it pornography. James Buchanan actually used it to try to go against George Bush, saying that this was the example of the type of thing government is spending its money on. And there was call for boycotts of the film. In some ways, Marlon Riggs himself said it actually made the movie more popular because everyone became interested in seeing it. 30 years later, it celebrated its 30-year anniversary in 2019 and won a Peabody Award. And Billy Preston, who is a very, iconic out star and celebrity, said it was the most important film of his life. One of the things that I really like about this film is it is experimental, so it may not be for everyone. It's very different, from instance, for Scott from the next film we're going to review. That's your pick. This is probably more along my area, but it is important, the topic, because the intersection of being Black and being gay is not really very explored, and when it is, it's glossed over. And and he really talks about the struggles with that. You have the stereotypical machismo, and of course the church in the Black community that he is facing, and then as well as some pretty blatant racism in the gay community that he discovers in the Castro area where he lived in San Francisco, where white gayness is celebrated but not Black gayness. So he's kind of reconciling these different feelings of basically feeling like he doesn't fit in either place, and I really love that about this movie. I'm anxious to hear what you think.
Well, thank you. It was definitely, I remember hearing about this movie back when Pat Buchanan and George Bush were running for president. And frankly, I'd never seen it. but what I pictured in my mind was a far more provocative film from a standpoint of what would offend conservatives than I actually found. The movie's certainly tame by today's standards as far as the graphic content is concerned, but it really it's one of these interesting kind of blends of genres, because it really it's categorized as a documentary. It's as much as anything kind of a performance art piece at times, and certainly not a film that's going to appeal to the mainstream audience necessarily, but an important movie nonetheless that people should see, because it, like you say, it opens up a perspective that we rarely have, and an insight into a world of kind of a minority within a minority community that we rarely have a glimpse into. The poetry of the film is fascinating, and it was interesting to look at kind of the credits at the end about who wrote these various pieces. Some of them were written by the filmmaker, and some are probably pieces I should have already been familiar with, but was not. But the interesting blend, like you say, very kind of experimental film. I was in film school in the early 90s, and while certainly a much superior film to anything that came out of the 4-year program at Oregon State University, it did remind me to a degree of some of the work that some students were doing with kind of experimenting with this technology of juxtaposing sound and video that aren't necessarily directly connected to create a deeper meaning that either would have by themselves. And I found it fascinating. The probably my favorite sequence in the film, as far as kind of giving me a chuckle from my limited entree into this community, that kind of the snapping the snapping lessons that they were giving, and the various kind of snaps that you can give as a gay man and what they communicate, because I've seen a lot of white gay men kind of emulate that over the years, and like so many things, so many cultures that we borrow from and don't ever really appreciate where it came from. I found it very interesting.
Yeah, and there's also a sequence about voguing, and of course the drag queens, and people don't realize that drag queens, voguing, all of that started with Black gay culture, not white culture. And it's interesting. I had to look it up because not too long ago I also watched, embarrassingly for the first time, Paris is Burning, which I almost picked as my pick because it's a fantastic movie. Almost came out around the exact same time, and of course that movie is about the balls and the courts and the underground drag scene and voguing scene in New York that people, like Madonna basically ripped off with voguing. I mean, and they made it mainstream, and then white heteros were even doing it, right? So it became like a huge thing. But it started, when you see Paris is Burning, and then you see some scenes in this movie as well, it's just these kind of, it's not as glamorous as it became with these huge fashionista stages. It started in these really underground, small little clubs where people would come out to show off who's going to be the best voguer, and it was a place for Black male queer identity to be showcased in different ways, with different costumes and different performances. And he just touches on that because this is more of an overview. He has the parades, he shows that, and then of course some of the political aspects. I think that he was prescient and that he predicted that the film would be controversial, even though by our eyes today it seems rather tame. There's hardly any nudity. It's really not that crazy by 20. I mean, I'm sure there's still some people would be very offended by it, but 2021 standards. But he, at that time in 1989, to present being Black male and gay in this way was extremely revolutionary. So I was excited. I wanted you to see this. I was excited to watch it again because it'd been many years and I wanted to see it with fresh eyes. So
yeah, really, and a film like say I should have seen, I'd heard of many times, and was excited to delve into it and have the opportunity to see it and to talk about it.
I wanted you to take you to queer film school, Scott.
There you
Me
go.
of all people having to do that, but I see a lot of obscure stuff. So
sure, and I've seen a lot of smaller queer films, but mostly narratives, and often really bad films. Often like you say, very few mainstream large budget movies have been made. And thus a lot of what has been made hasn't been particularly good. And not that budget drives it by any stretch, because this is a perfect example of a film that was made on a shoestring of a budget that 30 years later people are still talking about.
Yeah, it's still very important.
That's exciting to see, and awesome to see that it continues to find an audience.
So totally switching gears when giving your pick,
Yeah.
because I think it's good. We've got variety, right? It also shows that queer cinema spans, a huge, huge diversity, right? So
For sure, yeah. There's no easy segue between these two films, other than they are very culturally specific, I think. And so our next film is Pride. There's been several films named Pride, so so not to confuse it, this is a film made in 2014, relatively large budget British film. Did play here in Salem for a hot minute at Salem Cinema. But when I spoke to people about it, very few people had seen it, so I thought it was one I'd like to talk about, because when I did see it, I adored it for the story it told. As Black and African American as our last film was, this is extremely white culturally, and you can't. I want to acknowledge that. But it's also specific to a time and place. So this is a film based on true events around the coal miners' strike in the 1980s, I think 1984 perhaps, when Margaret Thatcher was cracking down on the miners in Wales and really making their lives miserable. The story, however, focuses on a small group of gay rights activists around a bookstore in London who, basically in looking in the paper are recognizing the way they've been treated by the police and by the government, and seeing the same kind of parallels with the miners being treated this way, and come up with the idea that they should work together and support the miners and raise money for the miners. So they start a meager fundraising campaign, and then find, when they contact various coal mining towns, that they don't want the money of a bunch of queers and wackos. So they basically randomly adopt a town in Wales that doesn't really know who they are, and to donate their money to, and end up visiting this town in Wales and striking up friendships and a partnership with this town. And of course, some hilarity ensues because of such different cultures mixing. It's a really nice little ensemble film. I watched a documentary about it and was pleasantly surprised to see that almost every character in the film is based on a real person. They interviewed a lot of those folks, and a lot of those people were extras in the final scene of the film that I don't necessarily want to give away. But it struck me as a really, as a fun film, but one that also teaches a valuable lesson. For years I was on the board of Basic Rights Oregon, and at the time, one of the things I learned in my time there was the importance of coalition building. When I first joined the board, I was kind of surprised, like, okay, so we're all about gay rights. Why are we talking about immigration right now? Why are we talking about abortion rights? And it took me a little while to realize the importance of various groups that share that various minority organizations, basically, not to put too fine a point on it, if we work together and support each other's causes, can find strength in numbers. And this might be one of the earliest examples of that actually happening.
yeah.
But I would be negligent to say I also enjoyed this film a lot because of the time it's set, and the very specific music choices and wardrobe choices, and that are very familiar and fond to me, as having grown up just a few years after this in the queer community. And the soundtrack of the film was delightful. It just added that very kind of nice memories kind of feeling to watching the film. And curious to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's obviously not as much my cup of tea as yours, and that I was like, oh, I know where this is going. And I was waiting for some of the cute scenes that indeed happened that made me roll my eyes a little bit, like when they go to the nightclub. And it's like the most, like, um, how should I put it? The most kind of like safe, conservative seeming gay nightclub you could possibly take a bunch of minors from Wales. So I was like, oh yeah, I'm sure this is what the nightclub was really like. Okay. Everyone's just being really nice and they can't wait to dance with the old people. But what I really liked about it actually is exactly what you're talking, the importance of coalition building. And as anyone who watches the show for a while knows, I'm a big sucker for any movies that take on issues of class. It's very important to me. I feel it's very underrepresented in cinema. And I found that to be really the interesting core of this movie, because you have the um, the gay activists in the film coming from London, and they're not all necessarily rich. Although one of the main characters that the film focuses on, who still lives with his parents, and he's kind of a little bit more upper middle class, you get the sense, than some of the other characters. But they're more urban, they're more sophisticated. They're going into this town in Wales where they're basically sort of like people they never even, they don't feel like they've even met a gay person before. They probably have, but they don't know it. And so it's, with some of the folks, it's more like curiosity than anything. They're not necessarily against or for. Then there's, of course, the evil villain woman who's against. But Melda
Right.
Staunton, and there's some other, Bill Nye. There's quite a few British actors in this that people will recognize, those who love British TV and cinema. So I would recommend it just for that. But I loved that exploration, the fact that they were joining together, with a group that they really seemingly had nothing in common with. And a lot of it was, hey, we're both being oppressed by Thatcher. Um, Gays in England were seriously oppressed under the Thatcher administration in the 80s, and obviously so were the miners. And so they found this commonality where you wouldn't think they necessarily had it. The other thing I really liked about it is it didn't wrap up in, it wrapped up in a little bit of a happy bow, but without giving out too much away. It's not like all of a sudden, like, yay, miners got everything they ever wanted, and that's it,
Right.
like, because it's
Right.
based on a true story and they actually
Right.
stuck with that. So I did appreciate those aspects.
Yeah, and anyone who is a student of history, I don't know, it's a spoiler to say that the miners essentially lost their battle, but it was not the end of the story. And the story continued for a long time after the movie ended. We got a little hint of, like I say, the happy ending that was based on reality.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed Bill Nye's kind of very understated performance. Anyone who is a fan of his will enjoy his performance in this film. He does a lot without ever doing much. A very understated performance. The one character you mentioned being the kind of the upper middle class kid that we're supposed to kind of anchor to. Of course, that was the one fictional character in the story that they.
Oh, he is, okay. I didn't know that. Yeah,
and
and that
virtually everybody
actor.
else.
That actor, I
George
did not write down his name, but wasn't he also in the big war movie from a couple
Yeah,
years ago, the
George
Dunkirk?
McKay. Yeah,
Yeah,
George McKay. It was in 1917. I think was the
1917. I always
yeah
get all my
yeah
war movies of recent years mixed up. It was
yeah
one of the ones I didn't like very much. I remember that.
sure. But I remembered him when I saw 1917. I fondly remembered having seen him in this film, and of course had a little bit of affection for that film going in, just because I really enjoyed that actor's performance. But wholly fictional, as I understand, as
Mm-hmm.
as so often when you write a true story, you have to frame it around something, and they chose to frame
Right.
it around a kid who was struggling with coming out, and it's they set him up as kind of the documentarian of the group, which gave him reason to be everywhere all the
Right.
time.
Yeah.
So it
He's
made
kind of
sense from a
the
storytelling
eyes. Yeah.
standpoint. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, I'm assuming this is a 4-star movie for you since you picked it, but it's a 3-star movie for me. So I can recommend it. Definitely, a nice lighter on romp than pretty much any of the other movies we're reviewing today. So,
Sure, for sure. And that's part of the reason I thought, let's have at least one kind of movie that's mainstream enough that, it could be a family film to watch and enjoy,
hmm,
and will appeal, I think, to a broad audience,
yeah,
many
for
of
sure.
whom missed the opportunity to see it when it was in theater. So,
Yeah.
and then if we move on to my next pick, it is, very much a very different film. As much as Pride is about a particular time, I felt like Tangerine was very much about a particular place. And I did so just to set up what the story is about two transgendered sex workers in West Hollywood, or just on the outskirts of West Hollywood, Cindy and Alexandra, sorry. Cindy is on a quest through the film to find her pimp, who has apparently cheated on her while she was in jail. And the film is very much the story of one night on, I believe it's Christmas Eve specifically, in downtown LA. And it sounds like a trailer for Die Hard, but kind of very different
No, very
film.
different.
As Cindy is in search of her pimp, and Alexandra is trying to do damage control through a lot of the film, I thought. It is, the film was known for, at least, got some extra publicity because it was shot on an iPhone. I think that's almost irrelevant to our conversation here today. It creates a certain look, but I think after the first 5 minutes of the movie, if that's what you're thinking about, you're not watching the movie, because it really is a great character study of two fascinating women and their lives, and the kind of cavalcade of characters around them. You said I just got back from being down in LA, and I did seek out these locations because I had, I'd heard it was very geographically accurate, and indeed it was. That from the donut time to the subway station and the
Oh,
Mexican food restaurant. They are all in about a 2 block area of
did you go to the donut
Los
shop?
Angeles. I, did, I didn't go in. I must admit, I
Oh, come
pretty much
on.
did
I would have
drive-bys.
loved a photo of you outside the donut shop from
I,
Tangerine because
I,
they spent a
I
lot of
should
time in
have
that
been.
donut shop.
They did, and they shot the film very guerrilla style. Again, it's not necessarily that evident in watching it, but one of the advantages of shooting with a small profile camera like that is they could more or less shoot without causing disruption. So while they had permits and they had permission to be everywhere they were, they never closed the donut shop. So there were times that customers came into that donut shop and kind of became part of scenes that they just let happen organically. And then after they happened, they talked to the customers and had them sign a release because, hey, we're making a movie. So there was a lot of really organic interactions in the film, both on the street and in the donut shop and the Mexican restaurant that were genuine because they weren't actors. But just a fascinating, very LA specific. I mean, very Santa Monica Boulevard specific location, and look into the lives of people who we drive by and disregard, or worse, most of the time.
Yeah,
And the two actresses playing these roles, I don't think were professional actors going in, and just
they're
really,
fantastic.
knocked it out of the park. Just a fascinating, kind of fun, kind of gritty, kind of, certainly funny, poignant film. The final scene was heartbreaking and sweet, and who would have saw that coming from the opening sequence at
The
that donut shop?
final scene is gorgeous. It's just
Yeah.
every single time I see this film, and I've seen it several times now. This is when, Brian doesn't watch the show. I don't think so. He may not hear me say this, that he was right, but he put it on his top 10 of that year and I didn't. I was just like just a nidge under that, but after repeated viewings over the years, it's definitely risen to the 4-star status to me. This is the film that, for me, got me interested in Sean Baker as a filmmaker, and now in my opinion, he's one of the great American filmmakers of today, of the younger generation, because he did Florida Project after this and just knocked it. That's one of my favorite films of the decade, period.
Right.
And then I've gone back and rewatched his earlier films. And one of the through lines for him, he is using non professional actors and sometimes blending them with professional actors, but often using non professionals. But he goes back and forth. It's not strictly non professionals. He's actually a film person, if you can believe it. So the whole iPhone thing with this was just sort of like that's something he had the budget to do, but also because these characters were on the move constantly, he just needed to be able to capture that wherever they were going. The other thing about him, though, is that he's really interested in people that are disenfranchised. That's why there is a commonality between this movie and Starlight, which is his one before this, and Florida Project, which is really on the people of the outskirts. And even in this film, he has the two transgendered sex workers that you mentioned. There's also the character of Rosmeek, who's the immigrant cab driver who has a crush on Alexandra, I believe. I can't remember if it's Cindy or Alexandra that he has a crush on, but he has a crush on one of
Yeah.
them.
Cindy, I think.
And his story is also very poignant because he's in this situation, that's very difficult as well. And so there's a lot to love about this film. I know some people didn't like it because the characters spend a lot of time yelling and fighting, and they're on the streets, and there's a lot of chaotic energy. And I think that chaotic energy makes you appreciate the quiet moments that do happen every somewhere. The Christmas scene inside the bar, which is lovely and beautifully shot as well.
Yep. Yep.
And then the end scene that you mentioned as well. So
Yeah, and I think, and I know we're running out of time. I need to move on to our last film, but also I thought a common theme with his films is, again, this sense of place. The Florida Project, King of Broadway, very much a New York film. That he even though he can't be from all of these places, he can't have personal experience with all these places. He does a wonderful job telling stories
locating
of
it.
particular places. Yeah.
And I love that too. I love directors where their film feels very rooted in a specific place. And in this case of Tangerine, a few blocks, right? Period,
Yeah, exactly.
basically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
definitely one to seek out. It's become considered now one of the great gay films of all time. It's often listed in lists of that. So I'm excited that we got to review this fully. So we'll move on to our last film, which is my pick. This is Tomboy by the great director Céline Sciamma, who is a French director who I've become another one where I discovered her late, and then I went back and rewatched all of her films. And thank God for Criterion Channel because they had all of them a while ago. This film follows a 10-year-old gender nonconforming child named Lori who becomes Mikhail or Michael over the summer when they move to a new neighborhood. Now, what's so fantastic about this movie, this is a coming of age story, which is one of my favorite genres, but it's also a very tender portrait. I would say next to Pride, this is probably our second, but more feel good type movie because even though there's some tough scenes, overall, Laurie has a lot of support, loving family, loving sibling, a lot of great moments in this film. And what I really liked about it is that it really captures that period of confusion where you're not sure. We don't even know by the end really where Laurie is ending up, or if Laurie will end up, quote unquote, picking a gender. That's the wrong word to use, but may not, and we don't know whether Laurie is interested in this girl that or that they've befriended. So I think there's a lot of nuance to it that I love, and beautiful photography, which we come to expect from Céline Sciamma, who also did, of course, the Oscar-nominated Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I'd also recommend her previous films, Water Lilies and Girlhood. She is an out filmmaker herself, and I like that because I feel like she has specific stories she wants to tell.
Yeah, a beautiful film. At times, I came. I have to admit that when I first saw the film, the ending really struck me wrong, and I had to kind of set back my expectations a little bit because I didn't want. I mean, it really comes down to the last line of the movie, and I do not want to give that away. I wished personally that they handled that differently, considering the subject. That being said, against projecting some of my own expectations onto it, but a beautiful film. My favorite thing that you didn't mention was the little sister. She was
the sibling. Yeah.
Yes, she was so good, and both as an actress and then just the story they gave her, the story arc they gave her as this loving sister who totally, is there for her brother when he decides that that's the way he wants to be perceived in the neighborhood. And instead of, she doesn't even bat an eye. She's like, okay, this is Michael.
Yeah, she's like, and she's kind of having fun with it. Like, oh, I have a brother now. It just kind of goes along with it. Yeah, the kid is great. And I know we have to wrap up. Disappointed we get to talk about that one more, but it's a 4-star movie for me. I'm interested. I'm guessing it's not for you, but I'm interested to talk offline
certainly 3.5
what your
stars.
issue with it.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it's kind of, we go into these with our own goggles on sometimes, and I had a way I wanted this movie to end, and that's not how it ended, and I have to let that go a little bit. But yeah, certainly 3.5 star film, bordering on 4-star, even with my own issue with the last line of the film.
And beautiful photography, and I would recommend people check out her other films because they're all beautifully shot. So thank you, Scott, for joining me for Under the Gaydar. We'll have to do another one because I feel like after I was researching the ones for this one, I thought of lots more I want to review with you. So
yeah, for sure, let's do it.
So as always, you can check out our website, realfilmsnobs.com. We're on Twitter and Facebook. We're on CC Media, Scan TV and Silverton, Corvallis Access Media, KMUZ Radio, KMWV Radio. Thank you, as always, to our fantastic sponsors, our crew. Thank you. Have a great day and great movies.